going to write about individuals in your paper. And in a lot of ways, I recommend that you don't, right? But sometimes you kind of have to. You're talking about how the social world affects people, and so then you wind up, even if you're talking about people, you're still kind of leading towards writing where you wind up talking about individual behavior. You have to remember that individual behavior, from the perspective of a sociologist, isn't important in and of itself. Individual behavior for a sociologist is a representation of something. Okay? This is important, right? The individual things that my mom did, whether according to Freud or according to myself, the individual things that my mom did. Let's say I'm writing about this article in my paper and I start talking about all of the things that my mom did to mess me up. Okay? Do I have stories like that? Just yes or no. Do you think I have stories that could fill up some of those pages? Yeah. Right? I was born and raised into a upper middle class, white Republican household. Right? And I am an atheist, queer, communist. Okay, I'm not a communist because there's not actually a functioning communist party, political party for me too. But I am an anti-capitalist. It just sounds fun to say that I'm a communist. Right? In that context, of course, I've got some stories that I could pull out of my repertoire about all of the ways that my mom, and because I am not going to be as patriarchal as Freud, I would include my dad, and even for that matter my brothers, in some of those narratives about how those people's individual behaviors are responsible for all of my psychological traumas. Right? That it's not a sociology paper, if that's all I do. My mom is not important in that narrative because of what she did to me. And at that, of course, I put air quotations because it's what she supposedly did to me. Right? As if she alone was responsible for those traumas. Right? Trauma, I'm not the specialist in trauma. Right? But the kinds of things that I would associate for my life, my childhood traumas, it was not a singular event. Right? So if you look in relation to, for example, a lot of people, especially older people, actually more so people older than I am, right? The whole coming out thing. Or if you just look at my personal experience with gender and sexuality, I'm not going to give you any details other than to say there was not a moment of trauma. Right? There were multiple moments that I didn't even actually experience as trauma at the time, but that did come to when I was 18 and I was trying to figure a bunch of stuff out. They did then come to manifest as things that were problematic. But I could very easily go back and say that my mom did all of those things to me, forgetting that there were actually all of these little microaggressions, all of these little moments where when I was here, this happened, when I was here, this happened, and they add up to become something collective. No individual person can be solely responsible in that particular way. That's part of what Kuntz is telling us about. But if I'm really writing about my mom sociologically, it is not about her person, and it is not about her specific behaviors, and it is not about me. It's about what she represents. It's about what her behavior represents. Right? It's about me and my feelings, but only what they represent about the social and cultural world. So I would be talking about my mom's behavior not through the lens of her person, but through the lens of the society that produces a person like her. And through the lens of the understanding that my mom is a part of a larger pattern. Right? One of the things that Coleman makes clear, it's not my mom that is responsible for me being fucked up. It's all of our moms are responsible for all of us being fucked up. That has nothing to do with actual people. That is just a pattern. It is actually a cultural idea. It is not even a material, personal reality. Because the material, personal reality is that my mom didn't actually fuck me up. If anything fucked me up, it was the brain cells that I myself killed while I was an undergraduate. Most of the other things that have happened to me haven't actually messed me up in any particular way. Right? That's just my own experience, but it's also neither here nor there. The point is that it is a cultural pattern where we equate mothers as the responsible parties for a whole generation of kids' behaviors. Right? And I encounter this all the time, particularly on this topic, particularly on the topic of raising adult children, right? Of which you all are the adult children that are being discussed. Okay? It started with my generation, with your generation, of course. This is the context that Coleman is talking about. This is the millennial context. Okay? I hear people say all the time, I hear my colleagues, I hear my siblings who manage, I have a brother who manages other people. I hear people all the time complaining about millennials. Do you all hear people all the time complaining about millennials? Being entitled, right? Being lazy, being self-centered and narcissistic, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Nobody there is talking about a person. People are talking about a pattern. That is a pattern. Right? That does not emerge randomly from one mother. Right? It is something that emerges from a whole entire society. I also hear this conversation outside of the context of class, where I all the time hear people talk about how parents these days aren't doing enough for kids these days, that, right, kids, like little kids. Kids have too much freedom, too much control. They're not parented enough. They're not this, they're not that, right? They cry too much at Target. They cry too loud at Target. They get what they want too much, right? Parents are doing this, parents are doing that. Do you all hear this as well? Right? Like, parents aren't parenting right. Right? But we still have non-sociological conversations about that, right? We blame that, it's framed as the problem is the parent. That the parents are responsible for whatever dynamic that we're seeing in children that we don't like. Right? I hear this, oh my God. I could never have gotten away with that kind of behavior. My mother would not have allowed that, right? This whole notion of kids talking back and all of that. I never could have done that. My mom would have whooped my whatever. Okay? Whatever behavior that we see in children that we find problematic, we blame the parents for it. Okay? Is there potentially a time and a place to have a conversation about the relationship between behaviors in children and their parents? Absolutely. The time and the place to have that conversation is not in a sociology class, nor is it in a sociology paper. Those parents are representative of a social pattern. And those kids are representative of a social pattern. Do not give individuals more power than they have. Remember that they are representations of something. Justin?
So I'm kind of confused. Is it also referencing the article that the reference from adult children being adults that are
No, it was referring to, it was simply referring to children who are legally classified as adults, who are still dependent on and or live with their parents. It's the fact that parents are now raising their children well into their 30s. Actively involved in raising their children well into their 30s. Whereas, of course, historically, parents used to be actively involved in raising their children, right? Historically, barely into double digits. And, of course, in the most recent industrial era of our memory, up until 18, right? I mean, historically, once people moved out of the house at 18, parents were largely done raising their children. So the point is that children are now also adults.
So, I'm going to try and contextualize it with me so I understand it. So, I'm 45. I have left a career where I am financially okay right now. But I have problems with anxiety. And one of the close people that I can confide in about that when I have troubles is my mother. So in that context, she's doing emotional work on my behalf when I call and I'm struggling. And so I would still be in that case where I am an adult child.
She is parenting an adult child.
Right.
Yeah. Now, and in the same sense, in my family, the way that this plays out is also exacerbated by the fact that none of my siblings have children. So there are no grandchildren. So I am the youngest, right? So I'm 38. My brothers are in their 40s. Right? There's no grandchildren to distract their attention away from us. Right? My parents are still, in a lot of ways, actively involved in parenting us as adults in the context of emotional labor. Of course, I would also critique that in the sense that I'm not going to share this recording with my mom, right? But in the moments that my mom thinks that she is doing emotional labor for me, I am actually doing emotional labor for her. Right? I don't need her. But she needs me to need her. So I interact with her in ways that allows her to get what she needs. I'm willing to let go of what I need so that she can have what she needs. Right? Because to me that's a fair kind of reciprocity. And because she doesn't have grandchildren to divert her attention away from me. Right? So I would also argue, I think that it could potentially be a slippery slope about whether or not having a relationship with your parents as an adult is the same thing as parents raising adult children. Adult children are often classified and understood as being literally materially dependent on their parents. Okay? So I am not Joshua Coleman. I don't know if he would include emotional labor in that classification. I think for the most part what he is referring to is a material dependency, where the adult child is still materially dependent on their parents for paying for housing, for paying for clothing, for paying for food, for paying for insurance, for paying for cars, whatever the case may be. And it does not matter the reason as to why the adult child is still dependent on their parents. It doesn't matter the reason. Right? That's not the point. Yeah. That's the same thing. Yeah, that's the same thing. Okay. So, one of the things I liked about the Stephanie Kuntz quote is because in the midst of the end of the article, where he does start getting therapeutic, it is my responsibility to direct you away from the therapeutic stuff and to pull you towards the sociological stuff. And this quote by Stephanie Kuntz is a really good illustration of the sociological perspective. Right? We live in a culture that expects us to single-handedly, or at most two-parently, to counter all of the comic ups and downs, social pressures, personal choices, and competing demands of a highly unequal, consumption-oriented culture dominated by deteriorating working conditions, interest group politics, and self-serving advertisements for everything from toothpaste to moral values. Or, of course, I would argue advertisements that integrate using moral values to sell toothpaste. Right? Or, of course, in the case of Chris Ingram, using toothpaste to sell the heterosexual imaginary. And I actually shit you not, there is an advertisement with wedding imagery in the Colgate. Right? It's like to make sure that when you kiss the bride that you have good breath. Okay? You can use the heterosexual imaginary to sell anything and everything. Okay? If you are sociologically explaining the parents that are being discussed and the adult children that are being discussed, you are not talking about the adult child who can't afford their own apartment. You are not talking about the mother who's like, what is it, the helicopter, isn't that the right phrase? That helicopter parent who's just like constantly, what are you doing? 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 Facebook. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Right? You're not talking about, oh my God, my mother will not leave me alone. Okay? That is not what you're talking about. If you're talking about this sociologically, you're talking about a highly unequal consumption-oriented culture and how that produces these patterns of helicopter parents and economically unstable adult children. You're talking about deteriorating working conditions and how that produces this pattern of helicopter parents and economically unstable adult children. You get the point. Right? You're talking about these social factors. Right? And of course, part of what Stephanie Kuntz is illustrating is that from the sociological perspective, and obviously Coleman supports this as well, so from a kind of counseling and psychiatric perspective, it's actually, as illustrated by this, unfair to put the burden of responsibility on individual people. When the presence of those patterns, right, what individual people are doing is coping with social arrangements. There's a big difference between being responsible for those social arrangements and coping with those arrangements. Now, one of the things that does happen that gets to be problematic, right? So the structure produces a behavioral pattern right, or some kind of social phenomenon. And then individuals organize their lives in such a way so that they cope with both the structure and whatever that social phenomenon or behavioral pattern is. Right? If the social phenomenon is the presence of social media, then what parents do is they figure out strategies to cope with the reality of how social media is shaping their kids' lives. But here's where it gets complicated. Structures have a tendency to produce coping mechanisms for us. Coleman talks about that, right? The structure produces all of these behavioral patterns, but conveniently also produces all of the self-help books. Right? So that the structure also tends to produce the tools that we rely on to cope. And then subsequently, the ways that we organize our lives in response to, in coping with these issues, function to reinforce the structure that produced the problem in the first place. Right? So that you can read from this. If you're looking at the unequal, consumption-oriented culture dominated by deteriorating working conditions, interest group politics, and self-serving advertisements, from that social lens, right, you read self-help books as a consumer market. right? That's what they are. They're a consumer market. You buy the self-help book, you're maintaining the very same market conditions that produced whatever problem got you to buy the self-help book in the first place. Okay? Of course, this is yet again one of the other ways. Why do I keep spelling that word wrong? Right? This is one of the other ways, right, that society kind of functions hegemonically. There's a big difference between coping and altering, especially because altering requires collective action. Coping tends to be individualistically, internally focused, whereas altering requires collective action. Okay? You're writing about a dynamic like this sociologically. You have to situate this dynamic within this larger structural context. Otherwise, it will fail to be sociological. And that is also, of course, insight in terms of making sure that you're reading the Coleman piece appropriately, both in terms of your own sociological perspective, but then also just in case you wind up using the piece in your work at all.
With several of these structures and institutions, as they are slowly changing shape, and coping skills are getting developed and so on, it kind of brings me back to one of the fundamental things. I don't know if we talked about it here in 101 for sure explicitly, but the sort of the lag that takes place in between institutional change and kind of micro level solidification of kind of a social norm.
Yeah. Right. When you talk about cultural lag, you can talk about structural lag as well. So Kathleen Garson, if you go back to the piece about resistant institutions, she's talking about structural lag, right? So that literally her argument is that the structure of the workplace is actually lagging behind personal and cultural desires to have more egalitarian relationships, right? Whereas, of course, there are other contexts where the structure has changed, but the culture fails to keep pace with that change, right?
And that's what kind of Coleman feels like to me, that there's been institutional changes, but the family is still adjusting to it.
Okay, well, that could be the case, but I would actually, my argument, I'm not saying that I disagree, but I'm saying that my argument is different from that. And that might be more of a therapeutic, that might be your reading of his therapeutic argument. My argument is actually parents are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They're doing exactly what the structure wants them to do. Right? So it depends. I suppose the answer to the question is it depends on kind of what social institution you put as the primary center of your analysis. Remember the thesis sentence that I gave you in your rubric? Right? I'm asking you to focus to pick one institution and put it central. I mean, obviously not the family. The family is, right? If you're talking about the economy, there's no lag. What's going on with adult children is exactly what is going to happen in the larger post-industrial economy. Right? But as you will see, as I will argue, everything about the dynamic that Coleman is talking about produces a consumer-oriented culture. And so as a result, it is wholeheartedly reinforcing the structure. Right? I mean, it's just very basic ways, all of the emotions that parents feel in this context and the pressures that are being put on parents and all of the emotions that parents experience in the context of those pressures tends to increase consumption patterns. Right? Consumption becomes a way to make our children happy. Buying things for our kids becomes a way to make our kids happy. Right? Buying things for our kids becomes a way that we can keep track of our kids. And then, of course, buying things for ourselves becomes a way that we can cope for all of those emotions that we're experiencing in the context of all of these pressures. Right? So we've actually already argued. You know that my PowerPoint slides are not often in any particular order other than whatever I was thinking at that exact moment. So we're not starting, of course, with the first bullet. But if you go back to what we've already talked about in the very beginning of the semester, that as we transition from an agricultural to an industrial to a post-industrial economy, we transition from subsistence to being a production-centered economy to being a consumption-centered economy. But we can also historically overlap that with a transformation from an institutional to a companion to an individualized marriage. And we can literally see, as you go from the companionate to the individualized marriage, you can literally track, materially track, how family life is oriented around production activities during the industrial era, whereas family life in the post-industrial era is organized around consumption activities. Right? You can see how the quality of those adult relationships change. Right? We go from simply expecting to be good members of our communities by being good husbands, where the individuals involved don't matter, to the companionate era where we're expected to have both, right, where we're expected to be a good member of the community in good standing as good husbands and wives, but we're also increasingly thinking that maybe we should like our partners. That's the whole companionate thing. By the time we go to individual, remember, we're not just supposed to like our partners, we're supposed to love our partners. And love is the centerpiece of everything that organizes those relationships. We start talking about the pure relationship, we start talking about the heterosexual imaginary, right? Where that romantic, ideological, romantic drive is what organizes our adult relationships with other people, our intimate relationships with other people. Well, the very same transformation has impacted parents' relationships with children. So this isn't random. This isn't because parents all of a sudden forgot how to parent. This isn't because kids are all of a sudden worse or, like they're poorly behaved. It's because of these larger structural economic transformations. Right? During an agricultural era and during an industrial era, kids did something with their time that they generally don't do anymore, not in the post-industrial era. It is a 4-letter word. Work. Right? This is a structural transformation that, of course, starts with labor laws, child labor laws in an industrial era. Right? But even still in the industrial era, children would, when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, they would start to apprentice. they would start to learn skills from adults, even if they weren't doing it in paid work. And then ultimately, when they were legally adults, which of course is just another point of reminder that adulthood is socially constructed through a legal system, right? But at 18, after a couple of years of learning a skill from adults in your family or in your community, you leave the house and you get a job, right? Kids aren't lazy or poorly behaved now in comparison to the past. They are simply living their lives in a completely different social context. There is no work for them to do. So you will note one of the very few positive things that is said about millennials. There's two positive things that generally are said about millennials. Is that you are more accepting of diversity than any other generation. And you volunteer more than previous generations. You volunteer in your community more than previous generations. That, by the way, isn't because you're better-hearted, more kind-hearted. It's because that is now the only way to get experience. Because there's nobody in your family, in your community, who can teach you skills anymore because they're too busy working 1, 2, 3 jobs and going back to school. Right? There are no paid jobs for you because I bet money that I don't have that if you could get a good paying job, you probably wouldn't be volunteering. Right? That volunteering is like the 21st century paid internship because there are no more paid internships. Right? So it has nothing to do with the personal characteristics of the people involved. It has to do with the larger social context within our lives are playing out. Right? So we already know, if we've already established that all of these other trajectories increase consumption, then of course it makes sense that this new kind of social parent-child relationship also functions as a consumer-oriented relationship.
I was going to say that even the educational institution is influencing the volunteering because a lot of high schools now are making it mandatory to have a certain amount of volunteer hours in order to graduate.
Yeah, there's that, and then also Harper is doing that. Have you heard about the Harper Promise? That Harper is starting to offer, and it's kind of inspired, not kind of inspired, it was inspired by President Obama arguing that the first 2 years of college should be free. So Harper's got this pilot program called the Harper Promise, where they're telling high school students that if they meet these criteria, they'll get their first semester of Harper paid for. And then if they continue to meet those criteria, then they'll get their second semester paid for. Ultimately, if you meet those criteria through the whole entire years of how the program works, you could have your whole 2 years of Harper College paid for. And volunteer hours is one of the requirements. A consistent number of volunteer hours. Yeah. Grade point average is part of the requirement. Volunteer hours, attendance requirements. There's a whole host of other requirements. So, yeah, my point is exactly that it's structural. It's the education system. It's high school policy about volunteering. It's college policy about volunteering. It's about not having paid jobs but still needing to get skills and experience. It is not necessarily because you all are kinder people and so that's why you're volunteering more. And of course, I'm not saying you're not kind people. That is not the point of the conversation. Right? It's always about looking at those larger structures. So, this is a long way away now, you've forgotten, but this is why I would argue that it's not even necessarily a lack, that it is, in part, the structure produces, right, this is kind of a present time. This is the culture that the structure produces, And the culture functions to reinforce it. The structure functions to reproduce itself. Okay? If there's a lag, the lag is a generational lag. That is, generations who think that their way of parenting is somehow morally superior to the current generation's way of parenting. That is also really sociologically problematic. It's really sociologically problematic to say that my parents raised me better than your parents are raising you. Right? Because again, that makes it about the moral character of the people. The only reason my parents did what they did was because of the larger context that produced their lives, not because they're better people. Right? We think about historical context. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. Right? My parents are old enough that they weren't hippies or feminists. Right? They do have really good taste in music, right? But my dad passed on a love of Dave Brubeck, not a love of the Rolling Stones, right? The point of that, of course, is that they kind of just missed that they are much more kind of 1940s, 1950s, generationally minded people. So that is, they're more industrially minded people than they are post-industrially minded people. Right? My mom was home, but she was not a helicopter mom. She did not engage in what Coleman refers to, but the actual, the original author. And I try to give you these references also because you've got to remember that if you're looking for additional references, that those kinds of things can help when you're doing research for your paper. Sharon Hayes calls this intensive mothering. Right? And of course what Coleman makes clear is that mothers are pressured to be intensive mothers. It's not a personal desire to be an intensive mother. It is, if society deems you a good mother, you need to be an intensive mother. So then the pressure is the relationship between the ideal mom and an actual mom. Right? My mom wasn't a helicopter mom, but it's not because she was better and she respected my individualness or my time more. It's because of the historical context. Right? I was born before Amber Alerts. I was born before the war on drugs. The war on terror in 9/11. Right? I know I can think of other things. Right? But those are just, for whatever reason, those are the only things that are coming to my brain right now. Those things, Amber Alerts, and all of the policies about child abuse and neglect that emerged in the 80s, right? The razor blades and the apples of the 80s, right? The whole idea about stranger danger, the whole idea that drugs were taking over our communities, and then after 9/11, that terrorists are taking over our communities, right? Never mind, of course, the economic instability and all of the other dynamics, right? When I left my house on my big wheel to go down the street to a point where I was no longer visible, my mom was not afraid. Right? My mom was not afraid. Part of that was because there's also, literally, people drove less. Because fewer people were out and about driving. Because more people were economically stable, which meant there were more people at home. Now, of course, you've got 2-3 cars per family, and so you've got double as many cars coming up and down the streets, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? There is a changing context that shapes perceptions of safety. Now, of course, we know that there are fears that crime rates are increasing, but you know, of course, that since the 60s and 70s, crime rates have been decreasing. So at the same time that crime rates decrease, parents and other people believe that crime rates are increasing. Okay? One of the biggest explanations of that is the 24-hour media cycle, which has to do with changes in policy, like the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and other kinds of policy dynamics that create the 24-hour news cycle, so that one crime gets repeated 24 hours a day across 100 different places, so that by the end of the day we feel like that crime happened 100 times rather than just once. Right? So that even though bed bugs are just in the city or just in New York, right? People in North Dakota are inspecting their beds too, because the news media makes it look like bed bugs are everywhere. So our perception of risk is heightened compared to the reality of risk. That is the context in which your parents are parenting you. And of course in which those of us who become parents are now parenting our own children. Because the mediated context, right? Now we don't just have stranger danger on the streets, right? Now we have stranger danger on the internet machine. And we have, of course, all of the added dangers of the fact that the internet is for porn, and so porn and sex, and I'm not saying that there aren't real abuses that happen in this context. I am saying that the social structure creates a gap between the reality of those threats and our perception of those threats. Does that make sense? So you cannot say that my mom is better. You cannot say that her generation's style of parenting was better or more superior. Or let me rephrase that. You can say that. Just not in my class or in my paper, because it's not sociological, right? Like in your personal life you can say whatever you want, right? But if you are thinking and speaking and writing sociologically, you cannot say that, because it is sociologically inappropriate.
Would it be reasonable in a paper with composition of that to maybe use like a case study introduction style mechanism? So I mean, we see it in a lot of the readings where it's, so-and-so is like this, and so-and-so is like this, and then you draw them into the sociological theme, and then you talk sociology to the rest of the person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm not telling you can't write about people. I'm telling you, you have to write about people sociologically. Okay? And with all due respect, for the next 15 minutes, I want to keep talking about this, not the paper. So if you have more questions about the paper, let's talk about those during our writing days or real quick after class. Right? Because there's just a couple of other things that I really want to get to. Okay? Was your question about the paper?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can talk about it later. Okay, so importantly, one of the things that I want to make sure doesn't get rendered invisible in this argument. And then also, this is a point where I will critique Coleman, because there is something that he renders invisible. There's something that he makes visible, but I want to make sure you don't forget it. Okay? I've actually been problematically talking about this as if we're talking about all parents. This pattern that Coleman is talking about is a pattern that emerges in what context? For which parents? Right. Okay, this is what he doesn't say. What he does say is that this is specifically a pattern that is primarily, which does not mean exclusively, but primarily emerging in middle and upper class families. And he references a sociologist, her name is Annette Moreau. And she wrote a book called Unequal Childhood. She's got an excerpt of that in terms of an article that, again, if this is interesting to you or relevant to your paper, I can easily provide for you. But nonetheless, she talks about concerted cultivation versus the accomplishment of natural growth. Okay? And this is a specific class phenomenon. But the outcomes are really pronounced. If you trace the outcomes of these particular patterns, they are economically rooted. In fact, it takes social class resources to parent in a particular way. But then also, when you parent in that particular way, it reproduces the class status of your children. Okay? So concerted cultivation is what Coleman is talking about. It's the parenting pattern of middle and upper class families. And the whole idea is that inside of your child is a special, unique, interesting person that needs to be cultivated. And so parents structure their kids' lives to explore and to find all of those skills, right? So the parent gives their kid language classes and art classes and music classes and this and that, and ultimately you might not like all of them, but through all of those activities, you might come to find your passion. Okay? The other part of concerted cultivation is the idea that children have agency. That is, that children have a voice. That children should speak on their own behalf. That children should be, right? It's in essence thinking that you should be like teaching your child to think critically. That you give your child an authoritative voice. So it is the difference between you are going to have this for dinner and what would you like to have for dinner? When you ask the kid what they want to have for dinner, you are giving that child agency because that child has control over the outcome of their life. They get to choose what's for dinner. Even if it's a limited choice. I see this in parenting all the time, and in fact, when I worked in social service, it was encouraged. Right? Instead of like saying no, or instead of doing this, right? Give your child two choices. And then see, right, let them choose. And of course, you're controlling the outcome. They're not going to choose gummy bears for dinner. Because you're not leaving it open-ended. It's what would you like? Brussels sprouts or broccoli? One or the other. You're still teaching that child agency, but you still get to control the outcome. You still get to control the narrative. But either way, that kind of a communication pattern, in addition with that kind of skill pattern, produces in those children a sense of authoritative voice. When that child encounters people who are in positions of authority, those children are more likely to engage with those authority figures as equals. Right? So I have students engaging with me as equals. Right? Or as, I might not be your equal right now, but I might be your equal in 10 years. In part because I see myself. I can imagine myself in your position. I have a rightful access to your position. Right? I'm certainly not even saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. But it reproduces a class pattern, right? If you're raised, when LaRoe says, kind of generally, if you're raised through the pattern of concerted cultivation, you are likely to see yourself as an authority. And then you are likely to imagine your professional future as including some kind of position of authority. Whereas if you're raised through the accomplishment of natural growth, which one of the dynamics there is that you do not question authority. Right? Oftentimes, parents are always or ever present in concerted cultivation. Which means the child is always supervised. Which transforms the context for the child to construct a relationship with people in positions of power. Children who are raised through the accomplishments of natural growth are more likely to be left unsupervised by adults. Right? Which creates a different context for having relationships with those adults. Right? People who are in positions of authority are ever present in concerted cultivation. If you're going to this class, you encounter this authority figure. You go to this place, you've got this authority figure. Here, right? There's all sorts of authority figures, and your parents are also always ever present, teaching you to engage with those authorities. They're people that you know, that you have consistent relationships with over time. And the accomplishments of natural growth, the authority that you encounter other than your parents are more likely to be strangers, are more likely to be in less intimate positions of authority, like as police officers rather than French language instructors. Okay? In part, we also have to understand that this isn't about good parenting, bad parenting. This is about which parents have the time and the resources to do one method of parenting and which parents have the time and the resources to do another. That is, social class produces parenting patterns, but then those parenting patterns reproduce the social class features of those kids. If you see yourself as having less agency and being deferent to authority, the economic future that you imagine for yourself will probably be in a position where somebody else has power over you. Right? Can you imagine yourself as being the boss, or do you imagine yourself as somebody's employee? Right? It kind of reproduces that class dynamic. But of course, one of the other things that's interesting, and this isn't referenced by Coleman, is that because of the history of racism, that we don't have to reiterate because we've already read about and talked about sufficiently, social class often overlaps in complicated ways with race. Okay? So one of the things that we find, for example, as Jill points out, is that there's a racial wealth gap. That because of slavery and because of Jim Crow segregation, middle-class white families have more wealth than middle-class black families. So by way of income, the black and the white middle-class families are in the same position. But by way of wealth, middle-class white families have more wealth. But the other thing, middle-class white families have not experienced the same racist housing policies that middle-class black families have. And this would, of course, also apply to other families of color. But here I'm specifically talking about Mary Patillo's research, which is specifically on black middle-class families. Her research is actually specifically also about the city of Chicago. Okay? So what she finds is that middle-class white families are surrounded by other middle-class white families that are similarly situated in terms of both wealth and income. Whereas because of racist housing practices like redlining and other dynamics that if you need more information about, I'm happy to provide you with resources, middle-class black neighborhoods are largely pocketed in urban spaces that are surrounded by poor black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot, the boundaries between the neighborhoods, of course, also are easily permeated. Right? So the kinds of dynamics that wind up shaping middle-class black neighborhoods are markedly different from the kinds of internal dynamics that impact middle-class white neighborhoods. Right? And so what this does is it increases the likelihood that black middle-class families will actually have parenting practices that look more like working class and poor parenting practices. Because of the boundaries, the slippery boundaries between neighborhoods, the dynamics that are in poor neighborhoods can easily sift into the dynamics that are in the middle-class neighborhood. Does that make sense? And in that context, mandates a different kind of, right, a differently classed parenting experience. So that there is a marked difference between the black middle class and the white middle class. That kind of looks at it in terms of kind of negative ways, that there's kind of more the problems, the social problems associated with poverty are more likely to exist in black middle class neighborhoods than they are to exist in white middle class neighborhoods. Okay? But the other context of that is white middle class neighborhoods are constructed in such a way that the white middle class essentially has no access to community, which makes two things more important to the white middle class: the nuclear family and consumption. Right? Of which, of course, in the nuclear family, work gets wrapped up in that, and in consumption, work gets wrapped up in that. Whereas in the black middle-class neighborhoods, what Patillo talks about is the presence of dense social networks. There's a complex, it is the kind of dense social networks that you're more likely to encounter in poor communities, that you're more likely to encounter in pre-industrial, kind of more subsistence-oriented communities, right? And we're talking about long-standing dense, right, where you've got a whole host of people who could help supervise your children while you're at work. You've got a whole host of people that can share resources for you. Who's reading on, what is it, Carol Stack, All Our Kin, right? Where, I mean, it's literally this kind of context where you go to somebody's house and you see, oh my gosh, I really like that couch, right? And a year later, that particular couch is in your place of living rather than in their place of living. But they have something of yours, right? Maybe a couple of outfits that they really like. And so there's this non-monetary exchange of resources that happens, right? In a dense social network, right? Without direct supervisor, there are always multiple adults that are supervising children with the permission of the dense social network. Just kind of in a loose way, right? I'm over here at the park, and there's kids over there at the park, and I am just going to be persistently watching those kids and intervening if I need to. And if I do intervene, nobody's going to call the police on me or think that I'm stranger danger or think that I'm doing something problematic. Right? Of course, that helps to shape the context. It's a completely different kind of parental experience. When Coleman was talking about how isolated middle-class families are, right? And of course, often what we're saying is these are white middle-class families. That's what he's talking about. There is no community. There is only the nuclear family and consumption, kind of as the ways of engaging with the larger social world, which makes those things all the more important, which then creates the context for all of the precarious issues that could come up as a result of that. Okay? Okay. I'm out of time, but just in case you're interested, he talked about how much it costs to raise children, right? But the numbers, of course, were a little bit out of date. So I did put a link on there that leads us to a 2015 breakdown of how much it costs to raise children in case you want updated statistics on that. By the way, if you want to do any collective action in the relation to the issues that are going on in family lives in the United States, one of the things that cost breakdown will make clear is that we should be fighting for publicly funded child care. In some way, shape, or form, we should have more public assistance for child care. Child care is becoming equal to housing expenditures in terms of how much money parents are spending on their kids. Okay? If you want to do anything, start talking to politicians about more creative ways to approach child care. That, by the way, has nothing to do with this class. It's just a political aside. And also, If you're carrying something plastic, hold on to it just a little bit longer and wait until you encounter a recycling bin. You know what I'm talking about? That I'm holding something plastic. I don't feel like holding it anymore. I'm going to throw it right here just because that's the garbage can. It's Earth Day. Hold on to it a little bit longer and actually put it in a recycling bin.